All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Anthony Hickling, and I am the Managing Director of the Carbon Leadership Forum, and I am joined by Meghan Lewis, who's our lead policy researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum. Our plan today is to briefly introduce the topic of embodied carbon and then talk about the ways that building owners and investors can take leadership in this space. So before we get started, I'd like to give just a brief overview of the Carbon Leadership Forum. The CLF is a program at the University of Washington that is accelerating the transformation of the building sector to radically reduce the embodied carbon in building materials and construction through collective action. We pioneer research, we create resources, we foster cross-collaboration, and incubate member-led initiatives to bring embodied carbon emissions of buildings down to zero. Through these tactics, we work to improve embodied carbon data and methods, we advance embodied carbon policy, and we enable collective action. To build our community for impact, we connect a network of architects, engineers, contractors, material suppliers, building owners, policymakers, associations, and other industry stakeholders through various forums, including our online community platform. We have active virtual focus groups, there are regional hubs, an NGO roundtable, and more. And so together, we enable research, investment, and action to reduce embodied carbon in buildings and infrastructure. To date, the network has evolved into a vibrant, engaged global community of over 6,500 professionals from across the building sector, academia, nonprofit, and government groups representing 200 cities from 33 countries across the world. This collective action model is dedicated to accelerating the transformation of the building sector to radically decarbonize buildings and building materials through collective action. So, now that you know who we are, we can talk about why we're all here today, which is that constructing and operating buildings has a huge environmental impact. And in the next 40 years, the global building stock is expected to double. That's an increase equivalent to constructing a new New York City every 35 days. So during this period of growth, we expect embodied carbon to make up nearly half of that impact. And for those of you who are new to the topic, embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions arising from manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. So in between construction and end of life of a building, we see the emissions that we're all really familiar with, and those are the operational carbon emissions. Those are related to the nature of energy usage and associated pollution generated by running heating and cooling, turning the lights on, et cetera, throughout the life of the building. To truly decarbonize buildings, we must address both operational and embodied carbon embodied carbon emissions. So embodied carbon is key to address because of two big reasons. The first one is that it's significant. So globally, building sector emissions are responsible for 39% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, with at least 11% of total global resulting from production of building materials themselves. And focusing on construction materials is even more significant when we think about the ripple effects it can catalyze across other industrial sectors like concrete and steel. So with buildings being one of the primary end uses for these projects or these products, carbon smart construction practices can drive significant industry-wide shifts beyond the building sector itself. And while embodied carbon emissions are significant at this macro level, supply chain emissions more broadly are also incredibly significant at the company level. So as is highlighted in the recent corporate action playbook from Breakthrough Energy, the majority of environmental impacts and exposures for most companies are found in their supply chains, not in their operations. So this diagram highlights the findings of the CDP Supply Chains Changing the Chain report that Scope 3 emissions, which are those that are actually coming from your supply chain, were actually 11.4 times as large as operational emissions on an annual basis. So it's clear that embodied carbon is significant, and it's also important because it's urgent. So in order to prevent the most extreme effects of climate change, we're working to make 50% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and to get to net zero by 2050. These are really ambitious goals and time's pretty short. So as you can see in this graphic, embodied carbon is primarily generated at the beginning of a building's life in its supply chain. So that's the tall yellow bar on the left. The blue bars then represent annual operating carbon for the building and show how these emissions are decreasing over time due to energy efficiency and grid decarbonization efforts. So For a building constructed in 2020, an estimated 56% of its total emissions are going to be embodied carbon. And there's no second chance to decrease these emissions other than when they're procured for the building. So you see right at the beginning, that's the time to be paying attention to this. And like I said, when we're anticipating so much construction that the equivalent of a new New York City is being built globally almost every month, we need to be doing something fast and at a global scale. So for industry leaders who are ready to tackle this urgent and significant piece of the climate puzzle, there are a few high-level strategies that we can employ. The first is, before you even know what a building is going to look like, you can start by thinking about how you can optimize that whole project. So for example, can you consider retrofitting an existing building instead of building new to prevent the emissions that come from using those new materials? Or can you satisfy project goals while making the building smaller? And can you design the building so that it can be taken apart and used somewhere else rather than demolished at the end of its life? Once you've decided what the project will look like, consider better ways to design and build it. So for example, can you adjust the building shape, or can you use more sustainable materials in the design itself? And finally, once you know what you're going to build and how you're going to build it, you can try sourcing the lowest carbon materials that meet your design specifications. So many building materials now have what we call environmental product declarations that are like environmental nutrition labels for products. These EPDs make it possible for us to know the embodied carbon footprint of materials. And to most effectively compare EPDs, we helped incubate a tool called the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, EC3, which is now hosted by Building Transparency. And you might have just heard Stacy and Vaslav talk a little bit more about this. With this tool, you can easily view all of your options to purchase for a product like steel and compare them based on their carbon footprint. Oftentimes, this free and accessible tool can help you easily make significant carbon reductions on a product without compromising cost or changing your designs. Looking forward, this is what a better future can look like. We can build with transformational materials. This includes making some materials less harmful, while also building a market for those that can serve as climate solutions that actually store carbon in buildings. We can also employ better design strategies, like I was just talking about, that prioritize practices like building reuse instead of rebuild, designing practices for disassembly at the end of their lives, and more efficiently using materials and building design models. And this work must be supported by businesses and political leaders who are committed to healthier communities and a net zero future. So I am going to now pass it off to Megan, who will build on the specific levers building owners and investors can employ to begin reducing embodied carbon in your portfolio.
I'm Meghan Lewis. I'm also work at the Carbon Leadership Forum, and I lead our research on policy, both in the public sector as well as the private sector. And I'm super excited to share some of our work with you today. And so what I'm going to do is start off talking about what is happening now, the embodied carbon policies and initiatives that we're seeing growing across North America and the globe, and then talk about, in particular, opportunities for people across the sort of building value chain, whether that's investors, developers, owners, and users, to play a leading role in creating policies policies and practices in their businesses to reduce embodied carbon. So first off, looking at the landscape today. So how are policies and initiatives growing across North America? And this is really in 4 areas. So starting off with government regulations and incentives that require reporting or limits on embodied carbon, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. Another area on corporate sustainability and reporting initiatives, such as the GRESB reporting index, which recently added embodied carbon disclosure science-based targets, which now includes scope 3 emissions, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more, business action on the sustainable development goals and the UN Global Compact, as well as the CDC supply chain initiative that Anthony briefly mentioned earlier, where companies are using that initiative to track emissions of their suppliers. The third area is green building certifications, such as BREEAM, LEED, ILFI's zero carbon certification, and more. BioNova published a report, I think in the last year, called the Embodied Carbon Review, which I would recommend, that actually identifies 105 other voluntary certification programs around the world that now look at embodied carbon as part of their certification program. And last, but certainly not least, are the growing number of voluntary commitments to reduce embodied carbon. So there's the AIA Materials Pledge for architecture firms, the SC 2050 commitment for structural engineering firms, the C40 Clean Construction Declaration Program for cities, and of course, a huge number of self-driven commitments announced by business leaders on climate. And while not every single one of these initiatives specifically relates to how a developer or owner would reduce embodied carbon on projects, they're really important for understanding how this is really growing and changing quickly, and also to know that the capacity to reduce embodied carbon on projects, whether that's the designers or contractors that you hire or the manufacturers who make the materials that you buy, is really increasing, and there's more action possible every day. So if we go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to touch a little bit more on policies, because people tend to hear that and say, sorry, what now? What regulations and incentives are we talking about? Just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're seeing. So the area we've seen the most growth in 2021 is in state and federal public procurement policies. And those are building off of, you may have heard of Buy Clean California, that put requirements on what can be purchased for public construction projects. These policies don't directly impact construction in the private sector, but they do help drive manufacturing of low carbon products, as well as building capacity among contractors, architects, and engineers to specify and procure those products. At the local level, there's a wide variety of policies that do impact the private sector. So there's city zoning and land use requirements and incentives, like the one in Vancouver, BC, and that's now being considered in other cities such as Boston. There are building regulations, such as the first low embodied carbon code that was passed in Marin County in 2019. That one focuses on concrete. There are green building incentive programs, such as those in Seattle, Austin, San Diego, Somerville, and elsewhere, that allow for expedited permitting, density bonuses, and other incentives for those that meet green building requirements, including embodied carbon. There are reuse and waste reduction requirements and incentives, as well as local or regional climate action plans that focus on setting embodied carbon targets for cities. And realistically, those can only be met by increasing requirements or incentives on private sector construction. Great, thank you. The next thing is that these solutions that Anthony mentioned a few of, in terms of what strategies we have to reduce embodied carbon, are affordable and widely available. So actually, the day of this summit, May 11th, there should be a report released by RMI that can be found on their building site that looks at the cost, the sort of economics behind low carbon projects. These three case studies show that projects were able to achieve 24 to 46% reductions in embodied carbon with less than a 1% cost premium. And this is something that we've seen really across the construction industry. And I'm excited about this report sort of documenting what savings are possible at that really low cost. So by establishing requirements to reduce embodied carbon from the beginning of a project, which is really only possible when investors or owners are requiring embodied carbon targets or goals from before a project starts, we can really see the opportunity to maximize carbon reductions and minimize the cost of achieving those reductions. And this is for two main reasons. So the first one is on the size of the market signal, depending on who is committing to reducing embodied carbon. So if someone like an architect or an engineer asks a manufacturer to make a low carbon product, there's only so much that they can do. They're not the ones that are paying for the building at the end of the day. And so it's really helpful. And we've seen that happening for a number of years. But what's really needed is a larger ask from people who are purchasing the products for these buildings to say that this is something they care about, so that if a manufacturer is going to, let's say, update technology in their facility, that's a 20, 30-year investment, they know that someone's going to buy those products. And the second reason that it's really important has to do with the embodied carbon strategies that Anthony shared a few slides ago. And that's because the earlier you start thinking about this in a project, the more opportunity there are across, and not just related to manufacturing materials, the example I just gave, but things like adaptive reuse or reducing the square footage of a building. There's just a lot more kinds of things that we can do earlier on that you might need to think about during site selection, or maybe you need to work with your contractor and engineer. And those don't typically cost more money, they just require more thinking earlier in the project to be aware of that opportunity, so that it's not too late by the time the project has continued and the site's already been selected. It's already been decided that the building will be demolished, the materials won't be saved, and those opportunities start to narrow. But that means that there's also a huge opportunity, because as we say at the bottom here, early collaboration means more opportunities and lower cost of implementation. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to spend the rest of our time together just outlining 5 key steps to establishing corporate policies and commitments to reach net zero embodied carbon. And all of these, this is going to be, we don't have a ton of time here, so this is going to be pretty high level, but all of these you can learn more about in our CLF owner toolkit that we launched earlier this May to support action to decarbonize the built environment. And these steps take you from the very first step of just knowing what your footprint is, how much embodied carbon is your company or project responsible for, all the way through integrating this across your company's policies and becoming a leader on embodied carbon. So if we go to the next one. Similar to how we talked about the opportunities at the project, at the project stage, and then optimizing the system, and then optimizing procurement, it's also important to think about the different scales that you can look at embodied carbon within a company. So there's the whole sort of portfolio scale, so every building that you're involved with, and then there's the project scale, so looking at embodied carbon on individual projects or buildings. And then there's the product scale, so tracking embodied carbon for an individual product. And all of these are really important and complementary, and taking action on any of them is a really important step to where we need to get. But they require slightly different sort of tools and methodologies that I'm going to touch on today. So I think it's important to sort of separate these out in your mind and know that they all work together, but they're all a little different. So if we go to the next one, thanks. So the first 2 steps are about knowing your footprint. And so, as you've probably heard way too many times, you can't manage what you can't measure. So understanding how to measure and track carbon is a key part of establishing climate targets and commitments. So first, at that portfolio or company level scale, this looks like tracking company level supply chain emissions or portfolio green building requirements possibly. And this the tools that are useful for this really depend on what your company is already doing. So likely this would integrate into your existing greenhouse gas accounting systems. And the key collaborators on this would be your internal sustainability team, sustainability consultants that you typically work with to help implement broader policies. And then the second one is on the project or building scale. And so this looks like tracking total embodied carbon for a whole building. And often this is done at the by area. So we'll say kilograms of CO2 per square foot or per square meter. And then you're trying to drive that number down over time. But in order to drive that down over time or understand what a good number is, it's really important to just start with measuring on one building to understand, okay, what does a typical building look like for us so that we can know where we want to be by 2030 or 2050. And there are a ton of tools out there for this. So there's something called life cycle assessment. And there are tools specifically for doing this at the building scale. So some examples I've included here are Tally, OneClick, and Athena. There are more out there that are more popular outside of North America. And all of these are the types of tools that architects, engineers, sustainability consultants, people that are working on your projects know how to use. And there are a lot of resources out there, including at the Carbon Leadership Forum, with other groups on how to use them. And then at the sort of smallest scale, at the individual product or material, we can track embodied carbon data per unit of material. So, per cubic yard of concrete or per ton of steel. And this can be done with environmental product declarations, as well as with the free tool that Anthony mentioned earlier, and you might have heard about from Stacy and Vaslav in the last session, the embodied carbon and construction calculator. And here, suppliers and contractors are particularly important. And I want to just say, I touched a little bit on the previous slide about or a few slides ago on the building value chain. There's for all these strategies at all these scales, you're never gonna hurt from talking to your project teams, whether that's designers or contractors, manufacturers. This is a really collaborative effort to reduce embodied carbon on buildings. As we all know, buildings are incredibly complex. And so I just wanted to highlight here some of the really key collaborators. And you can always feel free to bring in more people into the conversation. So if we go to the next slide. I wanted to pause here to talk about Scope 3 emissions, because we've we've talked about these a few times, and I mentioned them sort of when you think about tracking embodied carbon at the company or portfolio scale, you might want to think about scope 3 emissions. So so this diagram you may recognize from earlier in our presentation, talking about what is embodied carbon and sort of what are the stages of the life cycle of a building that are included when we talk about embodied carbon. So, from the cradle to gate, so thinking about, extracting materials and manufacturing them all the way through their end of life. So whether or not they're thrown away or reused. And when we think about scope 3, there's a heavy overlap. It's a little bit different. So if your company does greenhouse gas accounting, you are for sure accounting scope 1 and 2, meaning the direct greenhouse gases associated with the operations of your building. So that's where you see in the middle here at the use phase of when a building is being operated. But what scope 3 is doing, there's a lot of different emissions that fall under this category. There's 15 different kinds. But in particular, when it comes to embodied carbon, we think about there's categories called purchased goods or capital goods. And this is the emissions associated with the products that you're buying. And that includes the products that are going into your buildings. That also includes things like your coffee that your company buys. And so I'm just don't have time to get into all the nitty gritty of this, but just make sure that if you're interested in reducing embodied carbon and setting commitments, that you're talking to the sustainability team that you work with and consultants about, are we tracking scope 3 emissions? Is this a way for us to set goals and make sure that we're reducing embodied carbon? Because as Anthony mentioned, this is a really important way that companies can be leaders on climate, because it tends to be much larger than their actual operational commitment. If we go to the next slide. So now I'm going to step forward. So, okay, so you've started measuring and tracking embodied carbon, whether that's through your purchasing, tracking your purchasing and supply chain emissions, or you're just looking at the products that you buy and what their embodied carbon is, or you started to measure it on a building. And now you have enough information to set targets. And setting targets is really important because it helps your whole team know, as we've mentioned a couple times now, there's just a lot of people that are involved with making a building come together. And when you set targets, it helps communicate without you being in the room that this is something that needs to happen on the project. And it can be communicated really easily without everyone sort of being there or understanding every nitty gritty of the life cycle stages of a product or a building. And so here are a few examples of what that looks like at larger scale. So at that sort of company or portfolio or even city scale. So there's the 2030 challenge for embodied carbon, which asks the global architecture and building community to commit to a series of reducing targets. So starting with 40% below the current industry average of how much embodied carbon would be in a building today, and then decreasing to 0 by 2040. The C40 commitment is for cities and that one focuses on reducing embodied emissions by at least 50% for all new buildings and major retrofits by 2030, striving for at least 30% by 2025, and also brings in some other elements, including zero emission construction machinery. And then we also wanted to include this example from Kilroy Realty, who have announced a commitment to reduce embodied carbon in their development projects 30% by 2040 and 50% by 2050 from a 2019 baseline. And they also have scope 3 emissions commitments to reduce by 72% by 2050. And if you go to the next slide, this is looking at that at the next scale of the sort of product and project scale. So these are from green building certifications as well as from policies. And there are two kinds that are highlighted here. So there's a percent reduction target, pretty straightforward. So, typically our building or material is this, and we want to reduce it this percent. And then the other one is setting global warming potential limits. So that's, if we're going to buy a product or if we're going to build a building, it needs to be below this number. And so here are some examples so at the building scale, when we think about GWP limits, the zero carbon certification requires buildings to be below 500 kilograms of CO2 per square meter. And the material scale, by Clean California, and that's again for state projects, requires materials to be below a specific amount of carbon per unit. So for example, rebar has to be below 1.06 metric tons of CO2 per metric ton of steel. And then the percent reduction, so LEED requires teams, if they are going to be awarded credits to reduce embodied carbon by 10%. And then there's a similar credit at the material scale that awards teams that reduce by, well, at multiple levels. And then, Anthony, you can go to the next slide. So sort of thinking now past, okay, you've set your targets, you're measuring embodied carbon at whatever scale or at all scales in your company, then how do you move from doing this on a couple of projects and measuring it to actually making bigger steps to reduce embodied carbon? And that's when it's really important to think about how these the experiences that you have from early pilots can actually turn into policies. And this is sort of summarizing some of the places to think about doing that. And again, this is from our CLF owner toolkit, if you'd like to read more about this. And I think part of the reason that it seems almost obvious, oh, okay, if you're working on the project scale, it's really important to include embodied carbon requirements in your request for proposal, your owner project requirements and contracts. But what that looks like will depend a lot depending on the kind of company you are and what role you have in that building value chain. So for example, investors can set a policy to only invest in buildings with a certain embodied carbon intensity. Owners could set a policy to only buy buildings with a certain embodied carbon intensity, or to set a policy for how the buildings are constructed. And the same goes for tenants. But then so that's the actual project teams focusing on how a building is delivered. But then other teams to think about would be your sustainability team, who might be leading the charge on what commitments the company has, as well as how they're communicated and things like annual sustainability reports. Procurement teams who are leading purchasing of products or coordinating with construction teams to purchase those products, as well as track what money is spent on them if you're tracking things like Scope 3 emissions. And then also thinking about training. So whether, supply chain, real estate, sustainability teams, making sure that there are opportunities like this for people to understand more about what embodied carbon is and how to track it. And on that note, Anthony, if you want to go to the next one, I just wanted to highlight here, we'll be continuing to track more of what organizations are making commitments to reduce embodied carbon. You can see here some of the examples that we also have in the owner toolkit on our website of organizations that have committed to reducing embodied carbon specifically, or are focusing on reducing Scope 3 emissions. And we're really excited to see this list grow. And with that, I will just thank you all for coming here today and learning more. And I'm really excited to talk with anyone who'd like to learn more about this. And as a first step, you probably want to check out our owner toolkit. The link is here at the Carbon Leadership Forum website. And I'll pass it back to Anthony.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks everybody for joining us today. So as we always say, this work requires collective action and leadership. So it's great to see all the engagement that's already happening with CRETECH Climate. And we hope to be a really good resource for you all moving forward. And I will finish us off with our last slide, which is giving you some links on ways to stay connected with us.